from New York University, Abu Dhabi, as our distinguished speaker. So before we start, a couple of technical details. Please do not unmute yourself during the talk. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we will try to get at least some of them through to the speaker after the talk. We also have Professor Ramanan from Department of Chemistry, IIT Delhi. He's a senior professor here in the department. And I request Professor Ramanan to introduce our speaker today. Over to you, Professor Ramanan.
It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Panče from New York University, Abu Dhabi. I know him for quite some time, but we have been interacting over the last few years. Dr. Naumov is a native of Macedonia. If people are not aware of it, it is just in the north of Greece. He graduated from the Saints Cyril and Methodius University over there at Skopje. Later, he moved to Japan to do his PhD at Tokyo Institute of Technology. And after completing his PhD, he moved to National Institute of Material Science, where he worked for a couple of years. Then he moved to Osaka University, taking up an associate professor position. And he started, a new area, especially looking at different aspects of solid state phenomenon. And meanwhile, he was also working on, with synchrotrons. And probably it is around there, I think, he got into this crystals, which were making very unusual phenomenon. Many of them are considered to be thermosalient. And since then, he started working on the mechanical aspects of organic crystals, basically molecular crystals. He looks at many of them jump, break. They do so many things, and it's very, very fascinating. And recently, he started working on a very, very unusual interfacial area between solid state chemistry and mechanics. So it will be a very unusual talk, especially, at IIT Delhi. Now, Dr. Naumov moved to New York University around 2012, and since then he has over 200 publications, and many of which are very highly cited. He has received numerous awards. To mention a few of them: Harvard University's Radcliffe Fellowships, Frederick Wilhelm Bessel Research Award from Alexander Humboldt, Asian and Oceanian Photochemistry Association Prize for Young Scientists. And he is a regular visitor to India. In fact, he was planning to come this summer to IIT Delhi. But anyway, we are very happy that he has agreed to deliver this talk over here. On behalf of the department and IIT Delhi, which is celebrating Jubilee this year, we welcome Professor Panče to deliver his lecture. Dr. Naumov, you can switch on the slides.
Okay, I'm already sharing my slides. Are you able to see them?
Yes, we are able to see your slides.
Wonderful. And you can hear me, I guess?
Yes, everything is perfect. Yeah, you can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Professor Ramanan, for that great introduction. I'm really, really happy to be presenting this seminar. Thanks for the organizers, Somik and the others who made this possible. As Professor Ramanan said, I'm a very frequent visitor to India. It's really dear to my heart. I have a lot of friends and colleagues and former postdocs that actually work there, have positions. And I was planning, like every winter, this winter, to visit India, but unfortunately that is not possible. So instead, we are going to do this remotely. Nevertheless, I would like to, in future, to visit IIT Delhi and see everybody there in person. So I really appreciate you attending this. I know that it's not very easy to have lectures or seminars over the web. It's a different feeling when you have a presenter in front of you. But nevertheless, what's important is the science. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about dynamic crystals and the bigger picture, 2 points. And I would like to mention that all of this is nicely summarized in a very nice perspective article that you can see at the bottom of this page, which was just published this year. And the title of this article is The Rise of the Dynamic Crystals. So as you can see, we believe that they are on the rise. This is a subject that will be evolving. It's very popular. And we think that in the future, it will really be something that we can think as a future direction of the solid state chemistry research. So there is a lot of exciting development. We do only a small part of it, but I'm so happy that many other groups around the world have taken this on research and they are actively contributing. Okay, I'm going to start my talk with applications, because at the end of the day, this is something that we're all looking for. And one of the most important developments of the fourth industrial revolution will be the robotics and interaction of humans with artificial intelligence. Now, we're used to think of robots as being very stiff, made of metal, and this is important for conventional robotics. Nevertheless, we have also on the other side of the spectrum, and this is shown the Young's modulus here, this line is line spectrum. We can have the natural organisms, which have much lower Young's moduli. So I hear my echo voice, perhaps we can mute it. Okay. Yeah, I still can hear myself. Somebody has to mute their speaker.
Is it okay now?
Let me try again. No, I can still hear myself.
Okay. Okay, you can carry on.
Okay, that's much better. Thank you very much. So what we are trying to do is actually to work in the borderline between the natural organisms and the conventional robotics. And yeah, there's not much improved, fortunately. Okay. So we work on these organic crystals, which are basically between the natural organisms in the conventional robotics in terms of their mechanical properties. And we think that there is a very nice window here between of these materials, because we can harness the hierarchy of the structure in the natural organisms, and then we can combine this with conventional robotics to create soft robots, which are based on organic crystals. Now, if you think about organic crystals, they are very sturdy, very robust, very stiff. And in this research, we are trying to find out some special properties. And in order to do that, we rely on polymers. So as you're probably all aware, there is a whole direction in research called responsive polymers. And polymers have been created to respond to different stimuli, such as light, heat, even different pH or humidity. And these have been created in a composite version or pure polymers. They have been developed, mathematical models have been developed to model their behavior, and they're already also used in applications. Now, the inherent problem with the polymers is that they are inherently disordered materials, which translates in a very poor coupling between the external stimulus and the mechanical response. So what we would like to do is accomplish the same mechanical compliance by using crystals, because the crystals are obviously very ordered materials. And now when you think about crystals, you think that they are very rigid, but there is an increasing body of evidence coming from multiple research groups that crystals can behave very much like polymers for being flexible, mechanically compliant, and even responsive. So this is what are these dynamic crystals. We want to elicit some sort of response by applying a certain stimulus in a controlled way and a possible useful way. So the dynamic crystals are quite a lot. I would just want to present a selection of the most recent works, contributions from different parts of the world, and many of them actually come from India. So you can see here works from J.J. Vital, from Stoddard, Nangia, Aida, Barbour, and Kana Sureshan. We have other contributions from Sheikh Mobin, for example, for Ying Diao in the US, Shutan Tao in China, and Chris Akeroy in the US. So you can see even the research groups who were thinking of static of properties of the crystals are slowly shifting their research interest to these dynamic properties, because we believe that they are very, very important. And if you think about that, mechanical properties are actually one of the most fundamental properties of the solid state. We study structure, we study optical properties, we study mechanical properties, but somehow the chemists have delegated the mechanical properties to the engineers. And the reason for that is because most of us are trained as chemists, so we are not aware of the methods that we can use to characterize mechanical properties, besides them being one of the most fundamental properties of any solid matter. So I think now it's about time for us to use our knowledge of crystal engineering and supramolecular chemistry and connect that with the mechanical properties and bring these materials to the attention of the engineers who could actually use them later in applications. So there are really a lot of number of materials that show mechanical response. I'm not going to show all of them to you, and sorry for this is very busy slide. This was actually taken from a review that we published in Chemical Reviews in 2015. And you can see that even then, there are quite a sufficient number of crystals that can respond when we use light, heat, or that can be deformed or moved when we use other stimulus. And so you can see that they are chemically quite diverse. We have purely organic materials, organic, organometallic, or even metal organic materials. So there doesn't seem to be an actual pattern in relation to the molecular structure that we can find out to find some commonalities among these materials. Instead, we have to look at the crystal packing, and especially the anisotropy of the crystal packing that appears to be one of the key factors for the applications of these materials in the future. So talking about applications, we can think a range of applications, but I'm going to just mention 4 focus themes. So I mentioned already soft robotics for actuating elements, artificial muscles, and hybrid materials. We can think about microfluidics, so using these crystals as valves and gates. Think about electronics. Many of them are semiconducting or show some important electronic properties, especially when they undergo phase transition. So we can think about reflectors, tunable printing, and especially optical waveguides. This last point is very active research recently. I'm going to show something about at the end of this lecture. And of course, we can think about pharma and medicine, because mechanical properties, obviously, for solid state formulations are one of the key factors that determine their ability to be used in actual active ingredients, as active ingredients. You can think about also prosthetics and other clinical applications. So in order to somehow put all these developments into one umbrella, some time ago we proposed this term crystal adaptronics. Now, crystal electronics is actually a term which is borrowed from engineering. And in engineering, the adaptronic system or adaptive system is such that combines all functional components into one single element, even into one material. So if you look at the classical system of sensing material or system, we have a sensor, control unit, and actuator. If the smart system is such that incorporates all these units into the same material. So if you think about the crystals, we basically have a smart system because the crystal is able to receive the stimulus, deform, and then so mechanically respond to it. And this is why we can think about this system as a smart material or smart structure or intelligent material. So this is actually the analogy between the crystal and the classical smart systems. Now, having so many of these materials, we had to actually come up with some categorization. There are different ways to categorize them in the literature, but ones that we think is very important is based on their mechanical response. So you can see on the left side, we have restorative mechanical effects, where the crystal integrity after the effect is retained. And on the right side, we have disintegrative effects, where we have basically disintegration of the crystal after the effect has been applied. And depending on this, we have different materials, and we can have different correlation between the structure and the response. I'm going to show you throughout my presentation some of these examples without actually going into details of each one of them. Now, if you get away from the chemistry a little bit and think about mechanical properties or mechanical engineering, all these systems actually perform motion which can be simplified down to three basic types of deformations. And these are bending, twisting, and coiling. And the coiling actually is a combination of the bending and twisting. So we can actually simplify all these complicated motions by using simple elasticity theory, and we can represent them by using a tensorial approach. Now, I'm not going to detail into this because it's a little bit more on the physics side and less on the chemistry side, but it's very, very interesting development of this field. So let's start with a fast crystal dynamic system. And obviously, as Professor Ramadan mentioned, one of our favorite systems that we have actually worked a lot is the so-called salient effects. Why we're interested in these effects is because they appear to be the fastest dynamic response of organic crystals ever. I will show you several examples of these salient effects, which are thermosalient when they're induced by light, by heat, photosalient when they're induced by light, and most recently we're working on mechanosalient, such that can be moved or induce mechanical response when we are affected by applying a local pressure. These are very, very important because, as I mentioned, they are very fast, sometimes disintegrative, and if you think about these, the basis of this phenomena is basically you can convert one type of energy, which is a heat or light or mechanical pressure, into a different type of energy, which is mechanical work. So this is the big picture, but how does this happen? Well, how does a system which is static, dull, boring, can propel itself? This can happen in two ways. First of all, the crystal like this can eject the debris, and this is a very fast recording using a high-speed camera, or they can distort very, very quickly. In either case, we have mechanical motion that actually can exceed in length many times the size of the crystal. And you can see here on the right side that we have done a lot of thorough research to actually find out what are the basic properties in terms of the energy transduction that these macromolecular machines can perform. So let me give you some examples of photosalient material. In this case, we have a simple linkage isomerization where we have change of the coordination of this NO2 group to ONO group. And the problem here is how do we study these materials? We as a chemist are not necessarily skilled to be able to monitor them. So what we used is we turned to biology and engineering to find ways to track their motion. So here, for example, you have a very fast motion which can be approximated which can be tracked and put into numbers. And then we can use this tracking to monitor the effects in different materials or different crystals of the same material. And then we can do this to turn this kind of motion or kinematic effects into numbers. And this helps us to kind of find out whether there is some directionality of the motion, how we can correlate these to the chemical structure of the crystal, which I think is a very, very nice exercise for us as a chemist to kind of venture into different areas. This is a different example, a collaboration with Professor Vital from Singapore, where we actually determined the photomechanical effect, a photosalient effect as a result of dimerization. And you can see in most of these cases, we actually have disintegration, unfortunately, but in some cases, disintegration can be good. This can be used for some devices, as I'm going to show you later. However, in many cases, we have also retention of the crystal integrity. Now, what is important is how does this happen? To find out more about it, we have to study the crystal structure before and after transition. So we have basically a phase transition, first order phase transition. And we have a change of the structure shown here on the right. And if you compare the structure before and after the phase transition, you can find that they are very, very small change. So basically, in this case, which is just a simple tetrabromo benzene, we have a change of the angle about 8 degrees of these rings tilting. So nothing really spectacular happens here. You don't have a very huge rearrangement. What is the key of these processes is the extremely fast dynamics. So something happens in the structure that is probably cooperative effect by the first phase transition, first order transition, which is analogous to the magnetic phase transition that actually drives the mechanical motion and sometimes explosion. And this is a very nice example that shows you the difference of these phase transitions, which are basically magnetic phase transition in molecular crystals from the normal phase transition. So you can look at this plot here, which is a DSC. We have two phase transitions, which are separated about 10 Kelvin apart. And these two are completely different in nature. So you can see one of them is high temperature one is a normal phase transition, while the other one is very fast. So you can see this transition, if you can see the change in the color occurs by nucleation and progression of the phase front. So it's very, very slow. The other phase transition here is thermosalient, and actually in this case we have a very fast transition. So you can see this is 10,000 frames per second, very, very fast recording, and you can see the transition going from one side to the other. So the difference in the rate of the phase front between these two transitions in the same material is about 12,000 times. One of them is 12,000 times faster, which means that they have a completely different mechanism. This is why we think these phase transitions are very important. And talking to engineers, they will ask you, okay, so why, what kind of materials you can suggest for applications? So when I ask them what kind of properties do you want, they say we need something which is very fast, so it occurs almost immediately, and also it occurs completely, so 100% yield. And we think this phase transition actually fulfill both of these conditions. Now, in many cases, I said there's disintegration because the crystal cannot cope with that fast energy transfer. However, in some cases, you can retain the physical integrity. So this is one of our favorite compounds called pyroglutamic acid, and in this case, we can perpetuate the motion over 15 times without actually any disintegration. So what we can do now in this case is we can correlate the motion or the direction of the motion with the phase on which the crystal is sitting. So we can have a very accurate correlation between the crystal structure and the mechanical effects. So kind of we bridge the crystal engineering or structural chemistry with the mechanical properties or mechanical response, which is, I think, very, very interesting direction of research. In fact, these materials undergo so fast phase transition that they develop a shock wave during that. And you can detect the shock wave by using acoustic sensor, which is placed on top of the crystal and can detect the waves that progress throughout the crystal, and we can record the sound. So basically, from this sound response from acoustic spectrum, we can obtain information about how this structural transition happens in the crystal because it's so fast. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, of the mechanical spectrum, we have these very slow processes, so slow crystal dynamics. And this is related to something which is elastic and plastic deformation. So I would just like to give you a very short overview of the measurement of the mechanical properties and how they are done so that we're all on the same page. When you want to test something with mechanical properties, usually we use a 3-point bending test. There are other methods, of course, where we press the material, in this case, the crystal, on one in the middle, and then we are in this elastic regime, which actually where the crystal can revert its shape. But if we keep pressing, we go to the plastic regime, and then if we keep pressing further, the crystal will break. So this is the point of yielding or fracture. So as you can see, every material has elastic and plastic regime. It is the ratio of these two that determines whether the crystal will be considered elastic or plastic. So this is the basic picture. Now for elastic crystals, if you look at the molecular arrangement, what happens to elastic crystal, basically you have separation of the molecules on one side and contraction on the other side. In case of plastic crystals, you have kind of an internal separation of layers or delamination and sliding of these layers. So you can imagine that elastic or plastic properties will depend on the molecules in crystal structure. So there is also discussion of how does this happen. it was concluded that the important properties here is this rugosity or interpenetration at the layers or the interfaces between different layers. So if we have a system like this, which it will probably be plastic, if you have a system like this, it will be probably elastic because it doesn't really allow for this sliding to happen, or it will break eventually. However, we have to keep in mind that crystal is a three-dimensional object, so this anisotropy or difference in elastic or plastic properties has to be considered into 3 dimensions. So we have a system here when, although elastic or plastic deformation is not available in one direction, it could be possible in another direction. And this is what creates actually anisotropy in these materials. Now, in the recent developments of this interesting field, there are a lot of examples of other mechanical properties, which are quite exciting. So we have complete elasticity. A lot of this has been done by Amala Reddy in India, in Kolkata. We have superelasticity and ferroelasticity. In this case, when you press the crystal, apply pressure, and you remove the pressure, basically we have the phase that comes back to the original phase. In case of ferroelasticity, we have to apply mechanical force in the opposite direction in order to revert it to the original phase. So what is this superelasticity? Is basically when we have this stress-strain curve, when we apply pressure on the crystal, first we're in the elastic regime, and what happens next is a phase transition. So we have a mechanically coupled phase transition, which actually extends the amount of strain that this crystal can undergo. And on the way back, we have a hysteresis, and because of this superelastic transition, we have much higher strain for the same stress, and this is what makes these materials very special. So they can undergo stress strains up to 10 or 12%, while the normal materials can undergo maximum to 2%. So this is very interesting property. Another property is the plasticity of the material. So in this case, I'm showing you the example of a very simple molecule, hexachloropenzene. When you apply pressure on these materials, you can shape it in different ways. This is our collaboration with Mala Reddy from 2015. And what we found out that the mechanism here is basically a formation of these layers and sliding of the layers on top of each other, which can be very nicely seen in the SM images. So the same material can be very anisotropic. In this particular material, hexachlorobenzene, one of the simplest examples, we have a different response of the material depending on which phase we apply the pressure. So if you apply the pressure on 001 surface, you have a sliding of these layers because we have breaking and reformation of halogen-halogen bonds. And this makes the crystal plastic. However, if you apply the pressure on 100 surface, we have breaking of the pi-pi interaction, and in such case, we have immediate breaking. So the crystal shows a very different response depending on the anisotropy of the intermolecular interactions and the phase on which we apply the local pressure. So this is another example, more recent example, where you have the similar behavior. This happens to boronate ester. So we have, this material shows 3 different responses: plastic bending, elastic twisting, and breaking. If you apply pressure on 001, you have plastic behavior. On 010, you have elastic twisting. And in in the opposite direction, you apply normal to it, we have a breaking of the pipe interaction and breaking of the crystal. Okay, now we talked about breaking. How about recovering crystal? Now, this might sound a little bit science fiction and a little bit counterintuitive, but the way we break the crystals, we can actually reform them. So we had spent quite a lot of time in establishing ways to recover and self-heal crystals, which is obviously very important from the purpose of applications wherever the single crystals and especially organic crystals are being used, such as, for example, for electronics. So this is just a movie to illustrate this effect. This crystal has been damaged very much by pressing it with a metal object. And as we hit the crystal, you can see these separate parts, the splinters, they seem to tend to come together and form the original crystal. Now, when we saw this first time, this effect in these and other materials, We were quite surprised by this, but we of course tended to try to explain it by looking at the structure and by looking what is going on. So this is another example where you press the crystal uniformly. It basically you obtain these slices, but if you keep it in oil and then you heat it up, these seem to come close to each other and kind of try to regenerate the original crystal. Now this is very, very interesting, but of course we have to explain it. So what is happening here? When you press the crystal uniformly, you create these slabs, and they are actually in certain phase. When you hit the crystal, they undergo phase transition, and because they slightly change the shape, they look like they tend to come close to each other. So we have a mechanical effect combined with a phase transition. Now, can we actually completely reform or heal the crystal? Now, you might think this is not possible, but if you look at the field of polymers, again, we revert to polymers because they are really much more advanced than us. You can see that the self-healing effect there has been studied for quite a while, and it's not uncommon at all. In fact, there are different mechanisms by which polymers can self-heal. So this can happen by microencapsulation if you have, let's say, self-healing agents into macro capsules. So when these come together and break, these agents work their magic, and basically we have self-healing between the two pieces. It can be based on intermolecular interactions such as hydrogen bonding. It can be based on metal ligand exchange if you have a metal coordination complex, covalent chemistry such as Diels-Alder or covalent bonds, and finally photochemically as well. So in some cases we can shine light on the crystal, broken crystal, to have it repaired. Now we turn to different chemistries, and so we had a library of dynamic covalent bonds that we resorted to, trying to find such chemical reaction that is available in crystal, can occur close to room temperature, and can occur with a high yield. And after a lot of search, we actually ended up with this system, which is a disulfide system. As you probably are aware, the disulfide bridges are quite labile. They can be destroyed very close to room temperature, and then they can be reformed by formation of free radicals. So one other technical issue that we had with this research is how do we test? How do we know that the crystals have self-healed? So this sketch actually shows how do we do this. We have a crystal that we make actually an incision to guide the crack on the crystal. We stuck it to the tensile tester using silicone pads, and then we press it to crack the crystal completely. So then we separate it, and then we keep it for 24 hours. They put it together and keep it for another 24 hours, and then we wait for the self-healing to happen. And as you can see here, the proposed mechanism is that these disulfide bonds will break, form free radical upon breaking of the crystal, but then when we put the two pieces together, they will be reformed and contribute to partial healing. And perhaps if you don't really believe that this is actually happening, the way to check it is by simple mechanical test. So here, for example, you have a crystal that we can poke with a plastic object, and as you can see, the crystal remains as one piece. But okay, also you can revert the crystal and it won't separate. And this is very nice, but another more quantitative way to look at the structure is to use something that is used in a medicine, which is the computed tomography, CT scan. So we performed CT scans on crystals that have been self-healed, trying to find out whether the self-healing actually occurs inside the depth of the crystal. Think of these images as different colors showing a different density of the material. So if you have this green color here in the middle, that is the crack of the crystal. But if you scan the crystal throughout this depth, you see the crack slowly dissipating into the blue color, which means that the crystal has self-healed in the interior. We're now performing some other experiments using much more sophisticated experimental setups to try to find out more details about the self-healing phenomenon. Some crystals can be extremely compliant, and here we have one such plastic crystals where you can actually use the crystal to write, to twist it around the capillary, make rings, and actually twist it more than 3 rotations, 3 revolutions before it actually snaps. So what is happening here, again, it depends how do you apply the force. In one direction, you can induce the bending because we have these gliding planes where the layers will glide. If you apply the force in two directions, then we have twisting because basically we have two different forces in two directions. We have a gliding on multiple planes. And again, the same material can exhibit very different response depending on how do you affect it. Now, we were looking for a system where we can actually increase the self-healing yield. In the first system that I showed you, which is disulfide, we had only about 6% healing. However, in this case, we made a material which can actually have a much higher self-healing yield, and it actually can self-heal to about 60%. So one order of magnitude than the previous example. Okay, something happened and I'm not able to switch my slides. Oh, okay, there you go. So you can see the self-healing here goes from 67% in the first cycle down to 44% in the last cycle. So you can see that these properties can be actually enhanced if we have the right system and the right chemistry, and we're exploring now completely different chemistries in order to be able to increase the self-healing. Now this brings us to the next topic, which is a shape memory effects. This is a very popular topic, and perhaps you're familiar with the so-called shape memory alloys. So what happens with these alloys is that when you mechanically deform them and heat them, for example, by placing them into hot water, they will recover their change. And this is known for some alloys, for example, nitinol and some others. And it can have a lot of interesting applications, especially for making stents in medicine and other devices, where basically you can introduce certain shape, and by heating, you get a very different shape at the end. Now, can the crystals do that? Well, the reason I'm telling you this is obviously because they can. This is a crystal which has been mechanically deformed, heated, and as you can see that it straightens up. And then when you cool it down, it goes back to the original shape. And you can go back and forth as many times as you want. So how does this work with a molecular crystal? Well, we used synchrotron X-ray diffraction to analyze the difference in the outer part and the internal part of the crystal. And what we found is that they are of different phase. So what happens is when you apply mechanical pressure on this crystal, you actually change partially the internal part to a different phase. When you heat this crystal, this phase goes back to the first phase, and this is why the crystal straightens up. And we can actually see the phase boundary between the two phases by using SEM. So we have sliding of these layers. In this case, it's a simple terephthalic acid along with each other. So in a back and forth in order to produce this phenomenon. Here, this image shows how this happens. So we have applied pressure by bending. We have created a different phase. So we have a bilayer here. And then we heat this crystal and it goes back to the original phase. Of course, due to the defects and other imperfections, you don't have 100% recovery, but still we are able to see the phenomenon. We believe this is a much more common phenomenon, and it can happen with other materials that have a metastable phase. So now we have different types of crystal bending. This is the straight crystal. So elastic bending, as I said, occurs by separation and compression on opposite sides of the crystal. We have plastic bending by partial delamination, and then we have this new mechanism of plastic bending when we have a phase transition. So the internal and external part of the crystal are actually of different physical phase. Okay, I'm going to toward my end of the lecture, I would like to show you some current research that we are having in my lab, and also some possible applications that we think these materials could be very important to. In this research, we actually learned from molecular machines that you're all familiar with. So molecular machines are able to transduce energy on a very short distances, so across one or two or several molecules. And a lot of these have been made, and also the Nobel Prize was awarded several years ago for molecular machines. What we would like to do in our materials is to combine the molecular machinery or the mechanical effects on a molecular scale with the ones on the macroscopic scale. And this is our first system that actually is dynamic on both nanoscale and macro scale. It's a kind of a rotor where we have this molecule here in the middle rotating between these two molecules. And so, of course, there's the internal dynamic, but once you hit this crystal over certain temperature, it undergoes phase transition, and that happens to be thermosalient. So we have dynamics on a macroscopic scale and dynamics inside the crystal. We found some interesting correlation between these two different dynamics or different level of dynamics in the crystal, and that tells us that it doesn't really work in the expected way. Sometimes the change of the crystal structure can actually slow down the dynamics that happens on a molecular scale. And we also measured the actual force that develops in this crystal by a direct measurement, usually using a very, very sensitive sensor. So one of the trends and directions in this research is actually to be able to combine these systems into the same, these effects into the same system. So this is a case where we have a material which can bend under UV light by application of force, by using heat, and also and also can self-heal. So basically we have several or multitude of these effects in the same material. So we have a multifunctional adaptive system. And some of the applications, of course, there are quite a few, but this is one very simple one. Many people say, okay, the crystals break, what you can do with them? Well, what we can do with them is to use them in applications that require disintegration. So one of them is these fuses that we have, that we use commonly in electrical circuits, where when the current goes above certain amount, you have the fuses actually breaks and the circuit is broken. So this saves our equipment from being damaged. But the problem with these fuses is that they actually have they are liquid, they are metal alloys, and when you do that, they can go into gas phase, and you can still have some electricity passing, which causes the so-called arcing problem. Now we use our system here when we coated the crystal with the metal particles to make it conductive. And you can see the crystal here in a simple circuit, which is being heated by the electricity. As we increase the electricity, the current, it will break because it gets heated, and then it will stop the circuit. So it's a very simple solid fuse, which does not require any kind of evaporation or melting. A lot of research recently has been done in the direction of using crystals as optical waveguides. This can be done by using them as active waveguides or passive waveguides. And in this case, we can have transduction of either the light, the way it is, or in case of passive waveguides. In case of active waveguides, we shine one type of light, and what we transduce is the fluorescence of the crystal. So these are two different types of light transduction. And in this particular case, we try to combine the emission properties from different crystals. So we have a hollow crystal where we actually fill it with 18 small crystals of a different material. Each of them have complementary emission properties. So we cover the entire spectrum. Basically, this part covers the green spectrum, while the interior covers the red spectrum. So we have a hybrid or composite material made of two types of crystals. In this particular case, we used a light to control the shape of the crystal. So we shine a UV light, it happens to be azobenzene, and we transduce light from one side. So we can control spatially the output of the crystal as we use the UV light, and we can possibly use this, for example, to write or transduce a signal in a spatially controlled way. These maps on the right side show the intensity map of the crystal. This is a collaboration with Professor Rajadurai Chandrasekhar from Hyderabad. And in this case, we actually found that by using AFM tip, you can manipulate very small crystals, and you can slice them, you can move them around and manipulate them in a way that you can introduce them into optical circuits. So now we have, again, organic-based optical circuits. Now, the last part of my talk is about the quantification, how we can quantify these mechanical effects. This can be done by direct measurements of the force by using a very, very precise sensor attached to the crystal. And once we measure the force from here, we can actually find out a lot of properties, mechanical parameters, which can be correlated and compared with those of other materials. So here is a plot which shows the volumetric power density versus strain, and you can see that our crystals are somewhere here. They have a volumetric power density of about between 1 and 3 megawatts per cubic meter. So we basically are better than many of the other materials, but still worse than some of the other materials existing out there. And this is another example where we have actually a crystal which undergoes phase transition between the two phases. And in this case, we can measure the force directly, and we can combine these. We can plot these properties onto the big picture. And this is where I come to the big picture. Basically, what we want to do is to be able to compare how good these crystals are. And this is one of these plots which give you the overview of all the possible materials out there, materials classes that are used as actuators. And you can see where do the crystal, one of them, HMP shown here, stands. So it is quite significantly better than some of the, it is close with nanomuscles and electrostatic actuators and voice coils. It has a higher strain from good number of these materials, but also it has the highest stress than a good number of them. So we can easily see how well it would perform in devices before we actually make these devices. This is another example where we have a co-crystal, and again we use a very sensitive sensor to measure the expansion of these crystals in order to be able to obtain quantification of the mechanical performance. So you can see the crystals, it's difficult to see, but they slightly expand, so we can measure the force directly. Okay, so what are the future directions? I would like to wrap up here. We basically can do modeling, we can do computations, we can think about making a range of new materials, we can think about new methods to study these phenomena, which are very, very nice and interesting. We can use crystal engineering, and of course, we can have to use some applications. So I would like to mention perhaps this important point, which will be important for this community, and especially the work of Mala Reddy in Kolkata, who is doing an amazing work on plastic crystals. And we have, of course, Professor Desiraja, who has pretty much started this field some time ago. And in this case, he uses crystal engineering to predict the mechanical properties. I think these are very, very interesting developments to think about. So to give you the big picture at the end, we can use a crystal as an energy transducer. On one side, we have the light, heat, or force, so different stimuli. On the other side, we have mechanical work or force. But we can also think about other responses. For example, a crystal giving out heat or crystal giving out light. And we were working to expand now in some of these directions. And basically, we can think of single crystals as a way to transduce light, to transduce energy between different types, especially between radiation and mechanical energy, or kinetic and mechanical, or thermal and mechanical energy. So because my time is almost up, we have some time for questions. I would like to wrap this lecture and give you the names of the current group members and the former group alumni. Many of them actually come from different countries. As you can see from the flags, we have a very diverse group. Many of them come from India as well. And I would like to encourage you to visit our Twitter account and also YouTube. We posted many of these movies on YouTube, so you can actually. We also maintain the so-called Smart Crystal News on the Twitter, and this is an account which posts the most recent information about the smart crystals from the groups around the world. And finally, I would like to invite you to come to Abu Dhabi when the great crisis is over, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Naumov, for the insightful and stimulating talk. So it's amazing to see how you can manipulate these crystals for so many interesting applications. So I now request Professor Ramanan to take over the discussion and Q&A sessions. Over to you, Professor Ramanan.
Thank you, Panče. I think it was very exciting and stimulating to see. A few years ago, people used to think that molecules are unnecessarily buried in a crystal and it becomes useless. I think Professor Naumov has really demonstrated that these are small organic molecules. In all the cases, I think it is a very small organic molecules, and the aggregation in different ways can create a large number of properties. I think he has showed several examples, and at the end, he also showed how some of them can be taken for selective applications. Before we go in, I just want to ask you one question, Panče. How crucial the size of the crystals are for actually using for many applications?
That's a very good question, Professor Ramanan. I really appreciate it. I would just like to mention something related to your first point, that you mentioned the crystals the molecules were thought to be dead, basically. Now we are trying to kind of dispel this myth and actually bring to attention to everyone that the dynamics of the molecules in the crystal, which translate into macroscopic dynamics, can be actually the driving force and the key to harness the energy transduction by these materials. And of course, we can think about actuators, we can think about optical waveguides, and all these possible applications. Now, I think what is important is the softness of the intermolecular interactions that actually is between the covalent bonds and some very weak bonds, so van der Waals interaction. And this gives actually the softness of the softness is actually the key to these properties. Now, talking about the size of the crystal, we have found some systematic changes. So we lose some of the effects when we go too small in size, and we get them back when we go too large in size, and vice versa. We have some effects that are characteristic for small size, but we lose them in a large size. So size plays a very important role. Just to mention a couple of examples, when we have a bending crystals that bend under light, they will only bend if they are very, very thin. So they are needle-like or platy or something. If you increase the thickness, you lose this phenomenon, and you might get actually breaking or some explosion or something. So the mechanical effect does depend on the aspect ratio, as well it depends on the size. On the other hand, if we have a thermosalient effect, which occurs commonly for some crystals which are of large size, if we decrease the size, we do not have sufficient number of unit cells to accumulate the strain for this effect to occur at a small size. So we normally lose it at a very small particles, and we're trying to find now where is this borderline where we actually are still able to observe the effect. Now, there are a lot of other factors. For example, how do we obtain this powder, these microcrystals, whether they have some history of mechanical pressure, or they have been treated in some way. All of this will eventually affect the response. So I think there's a really, really interesting direction to kind of try to disentangle these different contributions, and actually to look at them, each of them separately, and try to figure out how relevant they are for the effect.
Okay, one question from the audience is that what is the functional appropriation criteria should an organic molecule have to become a good molecular crystal?
What is the functional?
What is the functional appropriation criteria? Basically, somebody is trying to understand whether the way in which you grow the crystals will have a influence on the the property of the molecular crystal.
Yes. So as I mentioned, both the internal structure, which of course depends on how the molecules assemble in the crystal, and the crystal imperfections, if they are present during the crystal growth, will determine the effects. In case we have defective crystals which contains a lot of defects, many of these phenomena are stochastic because they start at defective sites. So crystals which have a high concentration of defects would normally undergo the effect earlier or more often than those that do not have such defects. So it's not only the structure inherent to the molecular organization in a solid state, but also the purity of the crystal, and as I mentioned, the aspect ratio as well, as it plays a role. So we can induce some of these effects by, for example, intentionally damaging the crystal by creating a defect. And then we expect it to start at that point where the structure has been disturbed.
Another question is, since many crystal has low thermal expansion coefficient, how you improve this to use in electrical system?
This is a very interesting question. We actually found that for some of these materials, we have quite high thermal expansion. In fact, we have found that in case of the thermosalient transitions, at least in 3 systems that we have investigated in detail by temperature resolved X-ray diffraction, we have a very, very significant, actually some of the highest thermal expansion. I could mention a complex which is palladium. I can mention pyroglutamic acid, terephthalic acid, and some others, in which case we have measured the high thermal expansion. However, the key is not the thermal expansion, but the anisotropy of the expansion. So in many of these cases, we have anisotropic expansion, with 1 or 2 directions we have positive thermal expansion, and in 1 or 2 other directions we have a negative thermal expansion. So we believe that actual expansion is not the key, but the anisotropy, that expansion might drive some of these processes. Now, generally, how the problem of thermal expansion is solved is in metallurgy is, of course, to combine different elements which have a positive and negative thermal expansion in order to obtain a zero thermal expansion. So we think that in a similar way as it is done in a metallurgy, we can possibly accomplish a zero thermal expansion in organic crystals as well.
Yeah. Professor Pramit is here. So Professor Pramit is here. He has raised his hand. Yes, Professor Pramit, you wanted to say something? Professor Pramit, you have.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me, Shomik?
Yes, yes.
Yes, Professor Naumov. This is Pramit. I'm a faculty in the Department of Chemistry at IIT Delhi, Shomik's colleague. So thanks for sharing the story of the different types of crystals. Magnificent they are indeed. So I have a very simple question, which was kind of coming to my mind all the time. So can you specify that if I have this type of interaction, say whether it's hydrogen bonding or disulfide bond or pi-pi stacking, based on it, this will be mechanoresponsive, this would be self-healing. Is there like a logic towards the design of these crystals? Thank you.
Yes, that's also a very good question. So basically it depends on type of the phenomenon that you look at. In case of self-healing crystal, because we want to induce self-healing based on molecular mechanism, we intentionally look for crystals which are based on dynamic covalent chemistry, meaning such where the bonds can be broken and reformed around room temperature. We don't want to heat the crystal too much, because organic crystals, as you know, have a very low melting point. So if you heat them too much, they might become actually quite soft on the surface. So in case of the thermosalient or salient effect in general, basically we have found by comparison of many of these crystal structures in that you have to have a very strong anisotropy in the intermolecular interactions. So we have categorized them into 3 different categories. The first category is crystals where you have a very flat molecules that do not form any kind of hydrogen bonds. And what happens is that they can rotate into one direction or tilt slightly. So this is the case of the tetrachlorobenzene, for example. The second group is the crystals which have also no intermolecular hydrogen bonds, where you have bulky groups that prevent a central core. So these are flexible compared to the first one, which are rigid, but still you don't have extended hydrogen bonds in the 3-dimensional network. And the third group does have hydrogen bonds, but only in 1 or 2 dimensions. And these are probably the most interesting because they are the most resilient to mechanical stress, and usually they can be cycled many, many times. Now, why we think you don't need the 3-dimensional hydrogen bonds is because if you have extended network hydrogen bonding, then you basically have a means to dissipate the elastic strain which has been collected in the crystal during the compression or during the mechanical stressing. And this does not translate into mechanical motion, but we have effective dissipation of this stress throughout the crystal. This is why we don't find many of them that have 3-dimensional hydrogen bonds. But whenever we find one, it's obviously very, very interesting system to study. And in most of the cases that are now reported by other groups, we see a lot of them really. We can basically categorize them into one of these three groups by looking at the intermolecular interactions. So I cannot say that we have a very big systematic study, but I can tell you that we see some patterns from the crystal structure that we have been analyzing so far.
Thank you, Professor Naumov.
You're welcome.
Are there any specific application for these crystals in medical field?
Oh, that's a very, very interesting. We would like to come closer to that, but unfortunately, my group does not have really somebody who is experienced in that. And it's a very interesting direction that I also proposed in this perspective, but it requires a really different expertise or complementary expertise to what we have now. There is some interest, I would say, but it's still at the level of speculations and hypotheses. So we don't have anything firm yet. I think the closest to applications is electronics, where we actually have some simple devices made not only by our group, but by others as well. For example, flexible semiconducting devices, flexible optical waveguides, which can be on a macro scale or a micro scale. All of this has been demonstrated in practice. I think that is more like a low-hanging fruit for these materials.
Colleague, Rami's question.
Yeah.
Now the materials engineering people are using artificial intelligence to actually look at the structure property correlation, in particular the mechanical properties. So I think there are few people who have already developed algorithms to really correlate. I mean, especially shape memory, alloys, for one such example, looking at the different properties of these materials and how it can be, selected or used for a particular application. But I understand here, of course, the database is very, very limited because it's only the last 10 years or so that you have examples.
Exactly.
Anything in this connection with respect to, since artificial intelligence is becoming very significant?
This is a very interesting, Ramanan, and there have been some ideas around that. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, the database of mechanically characterized crystals that we have now is very limited. I mentioned that one of the reasons is that the chemists like us are not really familiar with these methods for mechanical characterization. And if you ask engineers, they're not interested so much in organic crystals. They look up to metals and ceramics and polymers. So there is this gap that I think should be filled in the future. And if the size of the database increases to the amount where we will be able to make these correlations, of course, that will be quite important. But at the moment, it's just like at the level of different people reporting the phenomenon and actually contributing different examples without actually much more systematic studies. So it's a very different, very interesting direction.
Audience, is thermosalient effect always accompanied by a phase transition?
Yes, that is correct. And that is the difference between this and some other disintegrated processes. We just had a paper in JAX which was accepted about 1 week ago, and we describe systems which also undergo disintegration, but in this case it's just a pure gas release. So many people unfortunately try to mix these terms, which are clearly defined as something based on phase transition, with disintegrative effects. And these defects where you have crystals actually disintegrate when they release gas have been known forever. Think about potassium permanganate, for example, or some other simple inorganic compounds. They would release the gas and you see the same phenomenon. But in our case, it's not a release of gas or decomposition. It's a phase transition that causes this. And the importance here is that you can actually cycle these systems back and forth, and you will still see the phase transition. So their reversibility is a very important asset that I think we should consider. And of course, we should not mix the term with something which involves decomposition or evolution of gas from the crystal.
Yeah, I mean, since I know that you are very much interested in gardening, a long time you mentioned that about the touch me plant and any towards looking at a material, which behaves like the plant. I mean,
Yes, we have several examples. Actually, there was a paper in Angela, not from my group, but from a Japanese group, where they made analogy between crystals, which are similar crystals, and in patients, these seeds that break, that jump when you touch them. There is something called Mexican beans as well, where the beans actually can go around, but in this case, the mechanism is different. You have a larva of a worm inside the beans and it can move. So there's a lot of analogies we can actually make with the real world. Part of our research is related to biomimetics, and we would like to think about these systems as very far analogies of biomimetic, of biogenic systems which can undergo motions. Some of my co-workers are working on actually incorporating these crystals together with polymers and making composite materials which will harness the dynamic nature of these materials and the softness and flexibility and compliance of polymers. That will be also a very interesting area to explore. These kind of composite materials would come closer to the actual biomimetic systems. We had actually a very small contribution several years ago on that, but I think it's really something interesting to be explored in the future.
Yeah, one thing, Panče, we have to really appreciate, your talk is that this is an engineering institution. We have large number of graduate students who are pursuing engineering in different areas. And even the mechanical engineering group have quite a lot of people working, using some of these materials, but not really, the organic material. I think probably you have excited a large number of people, to think about the chemistry beyond, solving a crystal structure and reporting the molecular structure. And then the molecules are not simply buried in a crystal. They can do many things if you can stimulate it in a right fashion. So I will hand it over to Soumik. Soumik?
Yes, thank you, Professor Rahman, for chairing this discussion and question answer session. And thank you once again, Professor Naumov, for sparing a little time from your busy schedule and agreeing to give this webinar. Thank you very much. And we would like to actually host you physically in the institute once all this COVID crisis gets over. So looking forward to seeing you here someday, hopefully very soon. And thank you once again. Thank you, Professor Naumov.
Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to my visit. I would be really happy to see you in person.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Panče. I think hopefully either I meet you at Abu Dhabi or you meet us at Delhi.
We will work on that. We will work on to bring you here, okay?
Yeah.
So before, I would also like to thank all the participants who have joined us today. And there is a small announcement before you guys all leave. So first of all, I would like to thank our head of the department, Professor Anil Elias, and Professor Ram Ramaswamy for mentoring us and extending their help in making this webinar series possible. And also, I would like to thank Professor Janakiram Vaitla and Professor Vishwarup Chakraborty, who are co-organizers of this webinar series. And also, we have a talk next week at the same time. So our next speaker is Dr. Adam Weingarten, who is the associate editor of Nature Communications. The links to join the webinar will be available soon on our website, and students are requested to register to avail for certificates. So we will provide special certificates to students who will attend at least 10 talks of this series in a year. So we hope to see you all very soon. Have a very great evening. Thank you.
Thanks again. Stay safe, everyone.